Round 7 of the Sinquefield Cup saw Magnus Carlsen squaring off against Fabiano Caruana, so the champion against the challenger. And this game was a dramatic one. It also bared a lot of weight for both players. It's sort of like a prelude to the World Championship. And for Caruana, a win would do him a huge confidence boost. But for Carlsen, this game actually is a battle for the #1 spot. If he loses this game to Caruana, Caruana will actually leapfrog him in the live rating list. So it's a matter of pride for Carlsen. So this game is definitely going to be one of the highlights of this tournament. Magnus had the white pieces and he opens with e4. And here we see a Petrov from Caruana, one of his pet lines that he has quite a bit of success with. So knight takes e5, we have d6, knight retreats, captures, and here knight to c3. This line usually ends up with white castling queenside. We have knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop to e7, bishop to e3, developing and getting one step closer to castling queenside, knight to c6, bishop to c4. We have castles, queen to d2, bishop to f5, developing, and here castles queenside, queen to d7, connecting the rooks, king to b1 from Magnus, putting his king in the corner, rook after e8, and here h4. Since both of the kings are castled on opposite sides, so it makes sense that Magnus goes for a wing attack. So here bishop to f8, pretty standard maneuver in the Petrov, just tucking his bishop back, so it gives more protection to the king. And here h5, just moving forward. h6 from Caruana, stopping h6 from white himself. And here we have bishop to e2, a retreating move from Carlsen. So what's the idea behind bishop to e2? Well, here Magnus wants to play knight to h2, and the bishop helps to support g4, so that white can push forward on the king side. So bishop to g4 from Caruana, we have knight to h2, and they exchange bishops. And here knight to e5, bringing the knight to a better square, and we have bishop to c1. Another retreating move from Carlsen. So this time, this move has two purposes. One is to defend b2, so this helps if black were to play moves like knight to c4 and queen to b5 in the future. And the other purpose is simply to push f4. So if white were actually to push f4 in this position, then here black has to move knight to c4, and this bishop can't move because, well, it's pinned. The queen will be captured if it does. So here queen takes c4 and rook takes e3, so Carlsen doesn't want to give up his bishop for the knight. So here bishop to c1, and here queen to c6 from Caruana, putting his queen on a more active square, and also with ideas of maybe queen to c4, trying to trade queens. f4 from Carlsen, we have knight to c4, queen to d3, and here Caruana senses that if he sits around and waits, white is going to have an initiative on the king side. So he decides to try and trade queens. He plays queen to e4, and here g4 from Carlsen. So he's really going for it. The plan is simple, just simply to push the pawns and bust open the king side and bring your rook to the g file. And here if black decides to take the queen, this actually helps white. He will recapture back, improving his pawn structure and also with a tempo on the knight. Here Caruana plays the provocative knight to e3, and we have rook e to d1, and here Caruana is forced to trade queens, so he captures, c captures, and here knight to d5. So this variation ends up being slightly better for black compared to the immediate queen takes d3, because the knight ends up being on d5, so it can go to f6 and guard the king in the future. And here you can see that both rooks are contesting the e file, But here Carlsen decides to abandon it and go to the king side. He plays rook e to g1, so he wants to push forward. So allowing black actually to play rook to e2. And I thought the rook move to e2 was instantaneous, but here Caruana plays rook to e6, probably trying to guard the 6th rank. And here Carlsen pushes g5, so already looking quite dangerous for Caruana. And maybe black should have played something like king to h7, just getting out of this dangerous line. But here knight to e7 from Caruana, with the idea of maybe blockading with knight to f5, so the knight holds some important squares. And here a very strong move from Carlsen, g captures on h6. Caruana probably underestimated this move, and Carlsen was feeling very confident. In fact, right after this move he went straight to the confession booth and actually gave a finger gesture, probably trying to tell his doubters that, hey, even though I might not be in the best form this year, but I'm still the world champion and the reigning #1. So here, Caruana, despite that mistake, managed to keep his cool, and he played very well from here on. He played the best move, which is rook captures h6, but here Carlsen has f5, which forces the rook on a very passive square. Caruana has to play rook to h7. If he plays something else, for example, if he captures the pawn, then here's simply knight to g4, and this is very strong. There's not much you can do as black. If you, for example, capture the rook, here you have the intermezzo knight to f6, and after king to h8, rook takes h1 is checkmate. And if instead you play something like rook to f6, then here knight to g4 is very strong. You can't take here because, well, knight h6 picks up the rook. So here rook to h7 is almost forced, and here knight to g4 from Carlsen. With the threat of knight to f6, this forks the king and the rook. So Caruana moves out of the g file. He plays king to h8. And this move also prepares the defensive maneuver knight to g8. And the knight on g8 does a good job of guarding these key squares. So here, instead of knight to g4, Carlsen could have tried a more stronger approach, f6. So here you can't capture with the pawn because it's pinned. So the knight would probably have to move, let's say knight to d5. And here Carlsen has knight to g4. So obviously you can't capture the pawn because that allows the recapture, and well, you simply lose the rook. Also the knight is hanging. Well, if you play king h8, simply rook to g8 is checkmate. And similarly, you can't capture with the knight, because if knight captures, simply knight captures back, this pawn is pinned, and this rook will soon fall. So here, the threat is actually to play knight to h6. So if black plays a non-move, for example a6, then simply knight to h6, and the line would go something like this, and you take on g7, and well, black's position is just falling apart. So g6 here, g6 from black is almost forced, but here simply drive away the knight after knight moves. Then here a calm move like knight to f2 is very strong because, well, you open up the g file for the rook, and well, this is absolutely dreadful to play for black. So f6 is probably a slightly stronger approach compared to knight to g4. But anyway, knight to g4, king to h8, and here f6 from Carlsen. But he probably missed that in this position Caruana had knight to g8. And it seems like white must have something in its position. I mean, look at black's pieces. They are just horribly coordinated, and this rook on h7 is just horrendous. There actually isn't an immediate knockout, but there is a way to achieve a positional bind in this position, and the computer suggests the move h6 with a very strategic idea in mind. So the immediate threat is to capture here and forking the bishop and the king. So if you play knight captures here, simply knight captures back, and after pawn captures, play the move rook to e1. So white is down a pawn, but he controls this file. And also this pawn, well, it blocks out the rook and the bishop. And well, you have a very comfortable position to play as white despite being down a pawn. And if instead of knight captures on f6, you play g takes h6, then here rook to h5, blockading this pawn. And here if you try rook to e8, simply rook to f1. And here black's only piece that is able to move is the rook, because this pawn and this rook totally block out the bishop, the knight, and the rook here. So h6 has a very strategic idea in mind. Magnus was probably looking for an immediate knockout, and he couldn't find it, so he played f takes g7. And here if you play bishop takes g7, then h6 simply wins material. The bishop can't go back to f8 because white simply goes bishop g5 with the threat of bishop to f6. So if you play a non-move, for example a6, then bishop f6 check. After knight captures, this rook is under fire, and also rook to g8. Checkmate is threatened. And if instead you try and block with the bishop, well then again just capture and knight to f6. And this rook here is trapped. So definitely bishop to f8 is not playable. So you would have to play bishop to e5, and here is simply rook to f1 from white, covering the square. So here you can see knight and rook are protecting the square, so bishop can't retreat there. And the immediate threat is to play d4. Well, you can stop it momentarily with c5, but after bishop e3 there is no good way to stop d4, and you simply lose the bishop. So definitely capturing with the bishop loses material, so here rook takes g7 from Caruana. Carlsen plays bishop to e3 with the idea of going to d4. The bishop looks nice on this diagonal, and this provokes c5 from black, which slightly weakens this pawn. And here Magnus went into a very long think. He actually went down all the way to about 1.5 minutes on the clock. And the reason for this, I believe, was because one, he felt pressure because, well, because of the confession he made earlier, trying to silence all his doubters. So he was looking for an immediate knockout in this position, but unfortunately he couldn't find one. So after a very long think, Carlsen plays bishop to f4, looking at this weak pawn. But here the commentators actually suggest bishop to d2, which is actually a slightly stronger plan. The plan is actually to bring the bishop to this long diagonal. So here rook to e8 from Caruana, and Carlsen plays knight to e3, preventing the rook from coming down to e2. So the rooks are traded off, and here rook to e6, so giving more protection to this pawn and also guarding this 6th rank. At this stage, Carlsen was just living off the increments. He plays knight to d5. Black responds with knight to f6, asking the question, where is this knight gonna go? Knight to c7 from Carlsen, attacking the rook, so the rook comes down, and we have knight to b5, looking at these two pawns. Rook to e6 from Caruana, defending this pawn. So Caruana decides, if I'm going to part with a pawn, better it be the pawn on a7. If here black plays knight captures on h5, This allows rook to h1, pitting the knight. So rook to e6, and here Carlsen plays rook to f1. Well, I'm not really sure what the purpose of this move is, but perhaps Carlsen was trying to confuse Caruana because at this stage, Carlsen only had, I believe, about slightly over a minute on the clock, and Caruana had about 8 to 9 minutes. So Caruana doesn't budge for it. He plays king to g8. We have knight to c7. The rook goes back to e2. The players repeat the moves a few times. And here both players reach the time control. So Magnus has a chance to catch his breath and reassess the position. But after some thought, Carlsen decides to repeat the position. And the game ends in a draw based on threefold repetition. And I can imagine that Carlsen must be quite frustrated with himself. But the good news is that Carlsen is still the world #1, and after this game, Caruana is still the sole leader of the tournament. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please subscribe for more future content. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.